For this first seminar, we're going to be hearing from 4 leading researchers on how we understand human mobility in the context of environmental hazards, as well as its policy implications. The title of this session, Conceptualizing Policy: Do climate refugees or environmental migrants really exist? This title asks us to consider the extent to which those kinds of concepts adequately frame the topic. Of course, this focus on concepts in no way downplays the reality of people who have to flee in the context of environmental factors. And the data on that reality is examined in more detail in the second session next month. Each of the speakers today will have 8, yes, just 8 minutes to present, and I hope you'll forgive me in advance for policing this policy strictly. Given the tight time frame, I'll also only briefly introduce each speaker, but their full biographies can be seen online by following the link that will appear shortly in the Zoom chat box that you bring up on the sides of your screens. During the presentations, I'd like to ask that you all pose your questions by typing them into the chat box too. When we've come to the end of the presentations, I'll select them from groups of questions to be put to the presenters. Finally, please do keep your microphones on mute and your videos off unless you are a presenter. We'll also be recording this session, which we estimate should last between 1 hour 10 minutes and 1 hour 15 minutes, and the podcast will be available next week on the RLI and PDD websites. So, without further ado, let me turn to our first speaker, Walter Kaelin of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Walter, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. About a year ago, I met a group of internally displaced persons in southern Ethiopia. They were pastoralists who had lost all their animals during drought and famine. They were now living in the vicinity of a very poor little town. They hardly received any humanitarian assistance, were clearly malnourished, exhausted, in bad shape. And as one of their old elders told me, they didn't have any future. He said, even if I would give him lots of animals, he would not go back to pastoralism because it had no future in the age of climate change. He also said that his brother had sent his sons to school. One of them now even had a government job, but he himself, he had missed that opportunity. His kids didn't have any formal education. They were condemned to a life in poverty. People like these, are they climate refugees? Are they environmental migrants? Are they disaster displaced persons? Are they internally displaced persons? How we frame the discussion, how we frame the issue is important for legal and policy issues. And it's important because we're talking about large numbers. Just during the first half of this year, IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, reports that almost 10 million have been newly displaced in disaster contexts, and we know the future is not bright. What I would like to do in these minutes I have is to talk about 3 possible approaches. One is what I call the climate change approach. The other is the migration approach. The third one is the disaster approach. The climate change approach is, of course, talking about climate refugees. People who have to flee and are in need of a refuge due to climate change. This concept has at least 5 problems. First, when we're talking about refugees in legal and policy terms, we're always talking about people crossing borders. But the very, very large majority of people displaced in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change remain within their own country. And psychologically, I still remember a very angry man on TV after Hurricane Katrina 2005. He had been displaced and he said, "I'm not a refugee, I'm an American." Of course, internally displaced persons are very often second-class citizens, but we shouldn't reinforce that reality with using terminology that suggests that they are not real citizens. Second, the notion of climate refugees brings us to the problem of attribution. A refugee in international law is someone who is displaced because of a well-founded fear of persecution due to political opinion, social background, etc. So a climate refugee would be someone who is displaced due to the effects of global warming. Scientists have a difficulty to attribute a single weather event to climate change. But just imagine how difficult it would be for a climate asylum seeker to make credible that he or she had to leave the country, not because of hazard, but because of a hazard triggered by global warming. And even where attribution is possible, we have the problem of multi-causality. We know that displacement is always multi-causal. Just let's take the group of pastoralists I mentioned. Had there been early warning, they probably would have destocked, sold their herds. They now would have had money to start a new life. Nothing of that happened. Had this man provided his kids with a education, there would have been a diversification of family livelihoods, and they would be better off, and so on and so on. It's always multi-causal. Demographic factors, governance factors, you name it. So, fourth, the problem with climate refugees is it's discriminatory. It excludes those who are displaced by geophysical disasters, earthquakes, and they can displace very large numbers of people. And finally, there are policy reasons. If we call for amending the Refugee Convention, aren't we then undermining today's asylum regime that is so much under pressure? And there are other reasons. I don't have time to go into them. But I must say, UNHCR correctly highlights that if people have a well-founded fear of persecution in the context of adverse effects of climate change, of course, they have to be recognized as refugees. The migration approach, that's something IOM was promoting with a definition back in 2007, defining environmental migrants as persons or group of persons who are compelled for reasons of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that are adversely affecting their lives or living conditions to leave their habitual homes and move either within their country or abroad. That's already better because it captures all kinds of hazards and weather events and geophysical hazards. It's better because it also captures internal displacement. But the problem is that the notion of migrant comprises not only forced migrants, as this definition suggests, but also people who migrate for predominantly voluntary reasons. And this is important in the context of climate change. If a father thinks, my kids don't have a future here, it's better that we move now and not being displaced in 10 or 20 years. It's predominantly voluntary, but it's still a coping strategy. And then the definition does not say what makes the movement forced. This is where the Nansen Initiative comes in. The state-led initiative that started with a series of consultations back in 2012, leading up to the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, and then as its successor, the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And there we have provided a definition of disaster displacement, situations where people are forced to leave their homes or places of habitual residence as a result of a disaster in order to avoid the impact and foreseeable natural hazards. So that's a different approach. What we are doing here is saying people have to move if they are first exposed, second to a hazard, and third are too vulnerable to withstand the impact of the hazard. And that's very close to the definition of disasters as adopted by the UN, which says a disaster is a situation where a community is simply overwhelmed, cannot cope with the impact of a hazard to which they were exposed. And we feel that's a more appropriate approach because it puts the emphasis really on the human factors, on the vulnerability, on the multiple reasons why people have to move. And it provides a beginning of criteria to distinguish forced from voluntary displacement. Of course, that's a continuum, but law is always binary. It always has to distinguish between the one or the other, because this disaster notion allows us to look at what would happen if people would have to go back. Would they be exposed to a serious harm? If yes, then they have been displaced. Let me stop here. I think we are talking about very complex issues. We should refrain from simple solutions. And I gave you 3 possible approaches, and let's build on those. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Walter. That's a great introduction to start off the seminar session. Moving very swiftly onwards, I'd like to invite our next presenter, Koko Warner from the United Nations University. Koko Warner, you have the floor.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. David, maybe since we met, I've changed affiliations. Everyone, my name is Koko Warner. Thanks a lot for the chance to be here. And I scanned the participant list, and it's really wonderful to be with our community. It's great to see your names, if not your faces. So I work now at the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has a secretariat. That's where I work. And I manage a subdivision on vulnerability. And I would like to address my comments. Walter has given us a good point of departure. And what I'd like to do is look a little bit further and ask some questions around demography, human mobility, and climate change. So it's, as Walter said, people are moving around the world for all sorts of reasons, both to manage their risks and to pursue their aspirations. And research has been actively engaged over the past 10 or 15 or even more years, trying to understand what are the variables that are changing, why do people move, how does it affect their lives? But I think all of us can agree that what all of us are after is living well and living peacefully and living stably. Now, when you add climate change to the mix, that starts complicating an already complex landscape. Climate change brings a number of disruptions. Some of them have to do with extreme events. Some of those look familiar: extreme storms, droughts, things that come and have great impacts and then may recede. There are also slow onset changes with climate change. Some of them we're already starting to feel: slow shifts in biomes, incremental sea level rise, areas that are facing changes in rainfall patterns, etc. Our society is also changing. Not only are the demographies of people in different regions of the world changing, some areas of the world are aging, other areas of the world on kind of in a big picture have relatively young populations. These factors also drive both our risks and our aspirations. And then finally, to bring it back to climate change, I think many of us really wonder, could this happen to me? Is there a risk that I and my family face? And what does that mean for the kind of society that we live in? And I'm sure all of you as legal scholars are actively engaged in those kinds of questions. When it comes to climate change, the UNFCCC understands these challenges. Our day job is to support the international climate negotiations. And many of you here have had a personal fingerprint on the handling of human mobility in the international climate policy arena. And I'm going to mention a few things. So I'm going to share my screen, if I may, or Susie, I'm not sure if you'll do this. For those of you who follow discussions about the adverse impacts of climate change in the UNFCCC context, you may be familiar with the work on loss and damage. And this first slide So my host has disabled participant screen sharing. And so Susie, maybe you can pull up these slides. And if not, we'll do this in our imaginations. If all of you could imagine, and here we go. Thank you so much. I'm just going to quickly share this 3 slides. This won't take too long. So let me hold just a minute. And here we go. This is a make-believe landscape. Some of you who are familiar with the work on loss and damage are familiar with this. Imagine or find yourself on this imaginary landscape. Where do you live? Where does your family live? And as you look at this, you'll see there are deltas, there are coastal communities, there are mountains and deserts and forests. Some of the, you'll see little circles imposed on this image. And those circles, each one of those icons represents a different type of climate impact. In deltas, you may see saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies. You may have problems with sea level rise, tropical cyclones, perhaps drought that affects your crops. And the reason why I show you this is the climate impacts mean a lot of different things to many different people, and it's situational. And so by showing this graph and asking you to imagine how might climate change affect you, your family, where you live and how you live, that starts setting the scene for looking forward and asking very specifically, well, what about people on the move? What are their needs? Do legal frameworks address those needs? If they don't yet, what is needed in the future to avert and minimize and address these impacts on people's lives? So here's a schematic, and hopefully you can all see this. I'd like to just walk you through 4 patterns. Some of these patterns are emerging in empirical field work. Many of you have been involved in that. Alex DeShervin, I saw you and many other researchers in the participant list. So I'm just going to walk you through these 4 patterns. Some of these patterns have not yet fully emerged, but they are possible in modeling. And I present this to you to kind of challenge the notion that there is one label for people who are on the move. And that presents, of course, from a legal point of view, a lot of questions. Let's first walk through these patterns. So we'll start on the left-hand side of this graph, and then we'll move out. So the x-axis broadly represents time. And by the way, this again is imaginary. It's just a schematic to help us think through this. So you'll see a little house all the way on the left-hand margin. And around that house, you'll see an icon that represents extreme events. Some of these extreme events have a climatic nature to them. They may be storms, rainfall, extreme winter or summer storms, drought, extreme temperatures. And what we're already seeing, and thanks a lot to those of you who do work on disaster-related displacement, PDD. You've brought hundreds and thousands of people and countries together in all regions of the world to talk about disaster-related displacement. What the research is showing is that people are often motivated to move because they're not safe, their homes, their assets are not safe, and they will move often in relatively short periods of time just to stay out of harm's way. When the conditions are safe again, they'll try and go back. So you see that kind of going out and trying to come back. Now moving across the x-axis, the next pattern that we see is livelihood-related mobility. A lot of empirical studies across the world have showed weather and climatic impacts on people's livelihoods. Think of pastoralists or farmers or fisher folk. Their livelihoods directly relate to if the rain comes, if it comes at the right time, if it comes in the right amounts. And when those patterns get disrupted, livelihoods can get disrupted. And some empirical research has showed that households use some forms of mobility. Some of them are literally commuting, got it? And some of them are farther afield. There are 2 additional patterns that we know less about from empirical studies, but we do get a sense, an early sense, that there are complex movements of people. We know that people who already live in areas that are torn by strife are vulnerable to disruptions in the weather. So there are these complex movements of people. Today, by the way, this livelihood-related mobility and complex movements, there are some legal frameworks to address the needs of those people. But the frameworks weren't created at a time when climate change was on the radar screen. So a real question is, to what degree are these frameworks evolving and preparing countries to avert, minimize, and address the adverse impacts of climate change for people who may be on the move? The pattern that we know least about and are only intuiting is really more of a question. What if areas where people live and work become less hospitable to living and working there? And there are questions about where people live and whether or not those will remain habitable in the future. Now, I see from David that my time is up. What I'll do, and David, if you don't mind, I'll paste this in the chat. The UNFCCC has responded to these needs. And 2 years ago, in 2018, a task force on displacement, which was created in Paris, just 3 years previous to that, they delivered recommendations on displacement. And I'm gonna put those in the chat with a link so that all of you can look at those task force on displacement recommendations, and hopefully that will enliven the discussion. Thanks so much, David.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Koko. Really introduces a great deal of nuance already into this discussion about the diverse impacts of climate change on these kind of demographic processes such as mobility. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing the UNFCCC, apologies for getting your affiliation out of date, there in the chat box for those who want to follow that up. So without further ado then, I move on to our third speaker, Francois Gemenne, who I tentatively say is from the Hugo Observatory. I hope you're still there, Francois, and if not.
That's correct. Thank you very much, David, and thanks a lot for organizing the seminar, and thanks to those of you attending online. The question of the seminar is whether climate refugees or environmental refugees are really a reality, and I'd like to offer 4 points of reflection about this question. We very often hear in the current mobilizations against climate change that one of the major effects of climate change on human societies would be to produce millions of refugees in the decades to come. And I think that this argument that is very widely used in the mobilization, but also in different environmental reports and press clippings, has really 4 problems with it. The first problem is that we always see migration and displacement related to climate change in the future tense, as if it were a risk that we would be able to avoid by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Especially during the coronavirus crisis, I'm sure that many of you have seen these stupid cartoons in the press that were representing the COVID crisis as one wave and then climate change as another big giant wave that would come afterwards. I think we have a real problem if we see things in that way, if we consider that the COVID-19 crisis is a kind of rehearsal before climate change. As a matter of fact, we shouldn't see climate change and the impacts of climate change, including the impacts on migration and displacement, in the future tense. This is already a reality, but from the perspective of Europe and of most industrialized countries, this is very often a reality that we don't want to see. We'd like to portray it as a kind of looming disaster that we would still be able to avoid. And what we don't want to see is that on the other side of the Mediterranean, that disaster is already ongoing. And I think that this reflects a very selfish view of what climate change is. In the same way that, at least from Europe, we had a tendency to dismiss the importance of the coronavirus as long as it was still in China, we have a tendency to dismiss the importance of migration and displacement related to climate change as long as they are on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. We took radical and urgent measures against the virus only where there were victims in the north of Italy and people coming back from ski holidays from Italy. the problem is that very often the victims of climate change are on the other side of the Mediterranean, and we tend to be blind about this. And this is the reason why we continue to see climate change as the next catastrophe, as a looming disaster, whereas it is already the case in many places of the world. That is really the first issue that I have with the current way climate refugees or migrants are presented in public debates. The second problem I have is with our tendency to set these migration and displacement apart from global migration dynamics, as if climate change were to bring about a new distinct category of migration and displacement. And I think that rather than trying to identify a new category of migration or displacement, what we need to do is realize the increasingly important influence that climate change has on the economic, political, or cultural factors of migration and displacement. Today, there is really, and especially since the beginning of the so-called refugee crisis in 2014, there is a tendency to try and put people in category according to the motive of their migration, as if we had political refugees on the one side, economic migrants on the other side, and then possibly in the future, a new category of climate migrants or climate-induced displaced people, call them however you want, but we have a tendency to set them in a third discrete category. I think this is really wrong. And I think that what we need to do is recognize our environmental drivers, many of whom are related to climate change, are really playing a role in global migration dynamics, are really influencing the political, economic, cultural, or other factors of migration and displacement. Problem number 3, when we describe climate migration and displacement as a looming disaster, we forget that in some cases, migration can be an opportunity, that migration can help people adapt, can help them, can provide them with additional resources or income, and that in many ways, people will engage into migration, not because they fail to adapt, but because they want to adapt and because they want to deploy their migration as an adaptation strategy. And I think that seeing this constantly as a disaster in the making makes us forget the benefits and opportunities that can be related to migration if that migration is planned and organized. And finally, the fourth problem that I have with that, which is perhaps the most significant, is that by floating the prospect of a new and looming migration crisis is only likely to reinforce the current prejudices against migrants and refugees, especially in industrialized countries. If the message from climate activists and other environmental organizations is to tell, well, you'd better reduce your greenhouse gas emissions because if you don't, then there will be millions of migrants and refugees knocking on your door tomorrow, I think it plays on a very xenophobic narrative that is likely to harm the current interest of migrants and refugees today, and that will not serve the interests of those displaced by climate change and other environmental disasters. This is not a narrative that is going to convince governments and population to curb their greenhouse gas emissions. This is a narrative that is more likely to convince governments to reinforce border surveillance and to tighten migration policies. And therefore, if we really want governments, companies, and populations to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, which is obviously an absolute imperative at the moment, we shouldn't use refugees or migrants as a prop to convince them to do this, because the reaction that it is likely to induce is a further tightening of migration policies, a further reinforcement of Fortress Europe or Fortress USA. And for many governments, make no mistake, that will be their way to adapt to the human impacts of climate change. And that's all what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Francois. A really thought-provoking set of observations that you've just introduced there on the relationship between climate change and mobility much more widely. And of course, the political implications in particular, they're particularly interesting to hear about. So thanks ever so much for the presentation. And we'll move on to our final speaker, who is Max Martin. So Max, over to you. I know you've been experiencing some difficulties with power outages, but you have the floor now, and hopefully you'll stay with us for the rest of the seminar.
Thanks, David. Greetings, everybody, and thanks for bringing me in here. I'm a geographer from Sussex, looking at how people respond to extreme weather and climate change. So this presentation looks at people's different mobility solutions in the face of extreme weather and change in the climate. Okay, so I call it Beyond Binaries. So that is the core argument, is that migration is a continuum and across time and space. And it is often hard and theoretically pretty unhelpful to have clear binary notions about migration. And indeed, the fact is that cause migration or contribute to migration, such as weather, climate, disasters, and so on. Can I have the second? Next one, please. Migration scholars have indeed looked at this aspect of the fluid, continuous nature of migration that can't be fit into boxes. It has been variously called unruly, mixed, survival strategy. And Kuntz has brilliantly put it, it's in 73 actually, billiard ball movement. So as Pickett has summed it up, these theoretical notions, the divide between the study of forced and voluntary migration is actually an impediment in understanding migration better. Next one, please. So let me take you to Bangladesh, where I have been working since 2012 till recently. I moved to South India, where I'm working with fishers faced with extreme weather now. That's where I am now. So it's a great delta of three amazing rivers, some of the fastest, some of the widest, some of the most voluminous. Three of them, and the catchment is outside the borders. So the precipitation happens up in the mountains, and the storms that come to the southern part are originated elsewhere in the North Indian Ocean. And weather patterns that happens elsewhere, that's in the long period swell waves to flood the coast of Bangladesh. Next one, please. So the disasters are rapid. At the same time, they often leave a long trail of slow processes that undermine people's livelihoods. So let me take you to a place called Polder 32 in Khulna district of southern Bangladesh. Polder means embankment in the Dutch language, the best ones in building embankments indeed. So it's a kind of a village covered with a walled river. So they built embankments, tall, huge embankments on both sides of the river so that the river doesn't flood the village. But during an intense cyclone called Ayla in 2009, this embankment was breached and the village was flooded. So it is near total destruction of farming livelihoods, fishing livelihoods. They fish from the fishing tanks inside the villages. The land remained salinized for about 3 years or so. People became dependent on aid. They lived on the roads. They migrated to different places. And the next one, please. And the next place is another village called, it's a smaller place, it's a village called Gabura, almost an island, surrounded by rivers. This, again, the same cyclone breached the embankments there. It was not fully embanked anyway, and flooded the entire village. And I was there in 2012, almost 3 years after the event, and still it was slushy. And I had to wade through ankle-deep mud to go and talk to the villagers there. And the villagers said that they didn't want to leave the place. So we'll come to that. So about 5 years, that place also remained unviable for any kind of farming or fishing. And the collective efforts are kind of building it back, has built it back to its more prosperous self. As of now, from 2018, they have been introducing salinity-resistant paddy, rice. Next, please. So the thing is, the migration happens across space. So many people reported from both places that their evacuation, the first escape was climbing onto a tree or a tall building, which usually is a mosque. It's a predominantly Muslim country, or schools. And they lived on embankments or cyclone shelters for several days to several weeks. And in some cases, people lived on sheds for a couple of years. So the migration happens to nearby villages, district headquarters, regional big city, work in camps. They go to cities to do different kind of work. It's a sort of income, different sort of income. Often they go seasonally to a city and still come back to the village when they can grow something, when the water recedes. Next one, please. So the migration across time is very dramatic. If someone stays on top of a tree, it's for a few minutes till the several surges of these walls of water, about 4 meters high, they just wash through the village. They just stay there. Sometimes they tie themselves to the tree. And the evacuation to cyclone shelter lasts a few hours, maybe a couple of days. And the displacement could be temporary shelters, it could be days ideally, but there have been cases of people living for up to 2 years. There is literature on temporary shelters across the world, why it prolongs. People live on embankments for days. Again, the migration to work could be days, seasons, years, or settle down somewhere for a lifetime. Next, please. So the dramatic actions of people involve saving lives, but also saving livelihoods. And those who move out, they save money, build more assets, they get back, they integrate to the economy. That's a very positive view of migration. It's not a rosy thing. Often they end up in very dangerous parts of cities or other villages where their places are flood prone. Next, please. So these people, let me look at people who do not move or do not wish to move. So that's also a sort of a problematic notion. Are they necessarily trapped, or are they unwilling to move? When I visited this village, Gabura, which was still wet and slushy 3 years after the cyclone, many people told me that they never wanted to leave because that's the place where their ancestors lived and died. It's their place. But at the same time, people did move for different spans of time. Some couldn't move because they didn't have enough money for transport or to settle in a big city like Dhaka, which could be expensive. So the policy hurdles at migrants' points of origin or destination could be an impediment for movement, or people could be unwilling to move. Next, please. So there could be the takeaway is that the mobility solutions are very wide, very varied. It's very specific to time and place and people, individuals, and communities indeed. So a sound understanding of factors that influence their movements, starting with climatic and environmental patterns of now and in future, could be helpful. At the same time, theoretically acknowledging the fluidity of movements and the messiness of movements, indeed the billiard ball movement of migrants could be useful in understanding migration better. And from a policy solutions perspective, experts might like to look at waypoints, safe passage, urban planning, where people live, where people move, and the freedom of movement, escape routes, and so on. It's hugely complex. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Max, again. Max Martin speaking there from University of Sussex. Really great that you were able to join us, I know in the midst of very difficult circumstances where you are. So thank you to all 4 speakers. You've now heard from our panel, and I can see that various questions have now started to be asked in the chat box alongside the Zoom screen, and you're very welcome to go there and have a look at those questions. I'm going to pose some of the questions that have been asked there to the panel. If you want to add some more for a second round of questions, you're very welcome to do that as the panelists speak to the questions that are already there. I'm not going to name the people who've asked those questions simply because we're recording and I'm not sure I have your permission to mention your names, but for those who want to see where the questions come from, please do just enter your chat box. So speakers, you've got, I would say, 4 or 5 questions, and you're very welcome to address whichever you think you're best placed to answer. The first of those is if people displaced by climate change are considered refugees at some future points, for example, under a new treaty, which states might receive them or resettle them? It's a question about responsibility there. I think we're one to go down that route. And a second question, again, along the lines of if such an institution existed, such that refugee status was a way of dealing with some of the movement-related issues that we've been discussing, would people actually go and claim asylum on this basis? Would people cross borders as a result of the kinds of phenomena that we've been discussing today? So some questions there about kind of the refugee response. There's a question too about the implications of adopting a disaster-based response to this issue, looking at mobility through the lens of disasters. And the question is, does that mean that, or what are the implications? Does that mean that governments should be investing in early warning mechanisms, infrastructure, building resilience, etc.? And doesn't that just displace the problem from one area, migration, to another area, which is response to disasters? I think that's implicit in the question. There's also a question here more broadly about, well, it seems that climate-induced migration or displacement isn't something new, but that perhaps the recognition of anthropogenic climate change is, so man-made or human-driven climate change displacement is perhaps something newly recognised. And should this cause us to reevaluate some of the moral norms that underpin existing governance structures? Should we look more to reparative or restorative ideas in responding to the challenges that, and opportunities that might be posed? And finally, a very specific question, I think probably directed towards you, Koko. How were the task force on displacement recommendations received, and what's been their impact, and what are the next steps? So those are the questions that we've received so far, briefly summarised. Again, you can see them in full on the chat box. So I'm going to go to our speakers turn by turn, and I'm going to give you 3 minutes to respond to whichever of those questions you think most appeals to you. And I'll go in the order of the speakers as we started. So Walter, I'm going to give you 3 minutes to choose which questions you wish to respond to.
Thank you. First, I would like to respond to the question regarding the implications of disaster approach. If people are displaced according to this approach, when they are exposed to a hazard and are too vulnerable to cope with the impact, and then as an alternative just have to go, then we really can take a much more holistic approach to the whole issue. Because we can try to reduce the hazard, and that's a reduction of emission of greenhouse gases. I fully agree with Francois that this is not in the foreground, the fear of a wave of refugees coming here, why we should reduce the emissions. It's even in our own interest, sitting here in the global north. But it is important, and that's an argument very strongly coming from small island developing states who say we need to keep global warming under 2 centigrades. We can try to reduce vulnerability. This is investing in disaster risk reduction, investing in climate change adaptation. But we also can invest into helping people, into reducing exposure by helping to people to move out of harm's way. This is about planned relocation. This is about opening pathways for voluntary migration. And then if this does not work, then of course we have to protect those who are displaced. So it's more holistic. It brings different silos we have in international negotiations together. Climate change negotiations, disaster risk reduction, the migration issues, even human rights discourses, we can link them together. And second, such a toolbox approach, as we call it, and as we are promoting it, also helps to get out of that bad discussion. How many, and do we have to close our borders, or should we open them? Because if people and if politicians feel we can manage to some extent the situation, including also accepting people who have to flee, but also helping people to stay, helping to move out of harm's ways through facilitating managed regular migration, I think that's much better. And then, of course, if you bring in human rights, many of these things to protect life, the duty to protect life, according to some case law, means that states have to take measures to reduce disaster risk, to help people to move out of harm's ways, etc. And then, of course, human rights also help to protect those who are displaced. Now, if you had a wider refugee definition, would people leave? First, I think what Madeleine Garlick put into the chat box is very important. Some of these people already are protected by the Refugee Convention. For the rest, it very much depends on the situation. Some would go, others not. It's very, very contextual.
Great, many thanks, Walter. Koko, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. These are the excellent questions. And I am going to bundle three together under the banner of science policy interface. And all of you don't fall asleep because you're all a really, really important part of this. There was a question about the implications of framing this topic as disaster displacement. And of course, one of the co-hosts for this session is the Platform on Disaster Displacement. So Atle and Walter, you would actually be the right people to address this. But you know, there's an emerging understanding of risk. If you just look at what we've experienced with COVID-19, and another participant, by the way, Alain Lavelle, the guy to talk about risk and how we're understanding it in additional ways now. But COVID-19, we're talking about it as a type of disaster, right? But it's it's not clear if we'll return to what used to be. That's not clear yet. And it's much, much more enduring disruption. And it's not that we're building back better, because I don't see COVID-19 knocking down buildings as an earthquake might. So our very notion of what hazard is, what exposure is, what vulnerability is, let's say it's being stretched and expanded. And that does provide us some insights about climate impacts. And so, you know, whether we call it one thing or another, it's a very worthy debate. Concepts absolutely inform science. And how those concepts inform policy informs what policymakers actually do, and that matters tangibly for people's quality of life and their stability, whether they stay, whether they move somewhere else, whether they can return. Two other questions also related to science and policy. Reevaluating our moral norms. I'm going off-road here because it's not my area, but we do need framings and philosophies that are appropriate to the challenges that we have in the 21st century. I don't know what they are, but we definitely need them. Our notions of borders are evolving. Our notions of, and just an example of that, often we think of borders as how far our identities go, or how far our rights go, or how far all kinds of systems go. We're literally in a time of talking about planetary boundaries, whether they're social, physical, or whatever. And so we need ideas and philosophy to rise to that challenge, because again, they will help define our policy responses. And the last thing I wanted to take on was the task force on displacement recommendations. You asked how they were taken up. They were taken up and wholly endorsed.
Very positive note on which to end. Thank you, Koko.
By the national climate. That's enough. Okay, fine.
Thanks.
Should I stop?
Sorry, yes. I think it may just be that my video stopped and I assumed you were, but please continue. Okay, in that case, I'll hand over to Francois as the next two of our speakers.
Thank you. Well, I very much agree with what Walter and Koko already said. Therefore, I will focus on the question about asylum and the possibility that we might, at some point in the future, grant people displaced by climate change some kind of a refugee status. Honestly, first, I think this is unlikely to happen in the current context and with all the difficulties today to just implement the Geneva Convention. I don't see how possibly in the current political context we could imagine having a kind of new international treaty or convention. And therefore, I think that very often framing this as a solution to climate change-induced migration and displacement is a way not to address the real issues and the real things that can be done. And still today, I'm getting annoyed by so many NGOs and so many politicians who keep on proposing the idea of a legal status for climate refugees or environmental refugees, however you call them. And I see this really as a way not to address the issue and not to consider what can really be done at the empirical level. And even in a fantasy world where we would imagine that the negotiation of such a treaty or convention would be possible, honestly, I don't think this would be a good idea. Because first, most of the people who move in reaction to the impacts of climate change move internally, and therefore any status in international law would only apply to a minority of those displaced, and probably would only apply to the most privileged amongst those displaced. We shouldn't forget that even people displaced by brutal disasters do not seek to leave their country. They just want to put themselves out of harm, and typically they will try and move as close as possible to the place they come from. And therefore, this is something that needs to be, I think, better understood, the fact that we need to support the countries today that have to deal with these internal migration and displacement, and possibly solutions from international law won't be of much help for those countries. And I think a second reason why I'm not sure that this would be a good idea is that if we consider that today, 85% of the people protected under the Geneva Convention, that is 85% of the refugees, are being hosted in developing countries or in emerging economies, that means that this idea of an international status is also very much, for many, kind of a way to put the problem on the shoulders of developing countries. Even if such a status existed, it is unlikely that a lot of people would apply for asylum in Europe or in industrialized countries. Most likely, those people would be displaced and hosted in developing countries who will pay the brunt of the impacts of climate change. The final point that I wanted to make is that we will need international solutions, though, and international frameworks, I believe, when it comes in particular to the issue of relocation and resettlement. An increasing number of governments will be displacing their populations in anticipation of the future impacts of climate change. You might have seen last year the decision of the government of Indonesia to move their capital city, Jakarta, from the island of Java to the island of Borneo. I think that we will need some international legal frameworks for these types of resettlement and relocation initiatives that are now taking place pretty much all over the world. And of course, we will need also international frameworks for the support, including financial support for the countries who today face most of these migration and displacement. So this is what I think we can expect from international law. I think that there are ways and avenues where international law can be more helpful than with a status, which is very much something that we run after, but without any chances of ever actually making it happen. And as I said, even if it were possible, I'm not sure this would be a good idea.
Very good. Okay, thank you very much, Francois. Max, just before I go to you, I wanted to quickly go back to Koko, whose screen froze, I think, a moment ago. Did you just very quickly want to finish the point you were making, Koko, about the task force on displacement?
Thank you, David. My apologies.
Oh dear, I wonder if we have a recurrence of the problem, Koko. Max, in that case, I'm going to give the floor to you and perhaps we'll come back to Koko again at the end.
Thanks, David. I fully agree with Walter, Koko and Francois on the points, and I would like to focus exclusively on the point about disasters. Yes, it's very important to improve infrastructure, make cities safer, make villages safer, and build resilience. But at the same time, disaster is something dramatic that happens once in a few years or even rarely. But day-to-day lives of many of these people on the forefront of climate-related events and processes are risk-prone. So instead of looking at disaster risk reduction, a broader strategy of risk management, risk reduction, risk appreciation might be in order. Just to give a quick example, the storm patterns are becoming more intense across the North Indian Ocean. There is a trend towards more intense storms. So the fishermen who go in small boats would like to know when a storm would pass through their area. And that kind of forecast is often not given because they think fishers don't go that far. But storm tracks evolution and its trajectory is very useful for a small boat fisher who might go only up to 20 nautical miles. So this kind of smaller tweaks in day-to-day livelihood strategies of people supported with good science might be a good start to look at to addressing this the so-called disaster risk, so rather risk reduction. Another issue is better science. The new normal is going to be more extreme weather. That's this agreement to that. At the same time, it's important to look at very remote events that might have a bearing on local events. Just to give a quick example, while we were on field work, one fine morning, on a calm day, there were high waves that destroyed a whole row of 8 houses, of field work village. So that happened. Luckily, they had warning from 3 days ahead that it was going to come. So that happened because there were some very severe event storm in Southern Ocean. So this kind of remote connections, teleconnections, better science, and an appreciation of people's day-to-day lives. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Max. That's a very useful round off to the end of the first round of questions. I think we've got about 10 minutes left, and there have been a number of questions posed in the chat box. And of course, as panelists, you're very welcome to choose others that you would like to address. But I think that there are, if you like, 2 main themes which kind of emerge from some of the additional questions. One of those is about responsibility. And so we've got some questions about if climate change helps to provoke displacement, then is there a duty on countries that cause climate change to help countries affected in that way by climate change? I know there's been a lot of work on that area, maybe a brief comment on that from one of the panelists. And the flip side of that, if climate change or disasters result in a lot of internal displacement, is that a way for convincing states to reduce emissions? So on that issue of responsibility, I guess, The last question, though, was one that appeared quite early on, and I wanted to save for the end because I think it really speaks well to the issues of conceptualization that we're looking at. And this was a question about whether separate causality might be equally, if not more important, than multi-causality in distinguishing between immediate and root causes in these sorts of contexts. And how does it feed into the questions such as social justice or injustice, power and history? And alongside that, is climate displacement scholarship a progressive step or a retrogressive or a step back? So two kind of big themes there, one about question of causality, the other about responsibility. So I'm going to go in reverse order this time. Max, would you like to take a run at either of those panelists? You've got about a minute, perhaps a minute and a half if you're lucky. So what's your time?
May I follow some of the other speakers, please? It's not exactly my field of study.
Okay, in that case, let me pass on to Francois.
Sure.
Yes, how to put this? I think that what we often don't see when we consider the potential solutions, including the potential solution for adaptation, are really the knowledge and the experience of the people who already experience such migration and displacement. I think that a key challenge for future policies will be to better tap into this knowledge and experience. And very often we tend to come up with schemes and policy schemes that are kind of developed and designed in industrialized countries, and we imagine that they will work in the global south. And I think that we would actually learn a lot from the experiences and knowledge of people who've used sometimes migration as an adaptation strategy or as a risk reduction strategy for years. And I think that we would have a lot to learn from these knowledge on the field. And therefore, sometimes, and I speak here from a research viewpoint rather than from a policy viewpoint, there is a tendency to try to pile up case study after case study, as if each case study was a further proof of the linkages between climate change, environmental disruption, and migration and displacement. And I think that what really matters is that we try to understand what really decides people to make the move. And this is one of the key issues at the center of a new research project that we're launching, which is called Habitable. And the question that is central to this research project is to try and understand at which point someone or a household consider that where they live is no longer inhabitable and that they need to move. And we see that this threshold of decision is very different from one person to another, from one household to another, and very often depends on the perception that they have of environmental change, sometimes even more than of these environmental changes themselves.
Fantastic. So I think part of the message there is watch this space. Let's see what comes out of this exciting summit.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Koko, I know you've been having some connection difficulties. Are you able to join us?
Hopefully, I will stay on. Thank you.
Any responses you'd like to give to the two questions posed or others?
Not knowing how long my line will stay stable, I think just as a reflection, we see the tensions between existing frameworks. For example, existing frameworks that were defined in the 20th century, really kind of migration, often labor-based migration schemes, crossing national borders, and of course, asylum frameworks. And the real questions that are coming up, at least in the sphere where I'm working, which is climate change, is what frameworks are needed for, and Francois very much accept what you're saying. It's not that the risks are very far off. We're experiencing some of these risks right now and they're emerging. But what's necessary to avert and minimize and address these impacts in a context of sustainable development? I know that that's also one of those terms. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but broadly, what does that look like? What concepts do we need? And what constructs are needed to keep people, safe and living dignified lives where they're, the areas of origin or elsewhere. And that's really, it's an open question. And this community plays a really important role. So I just invite all of you to actively publish, actively debate, and come and contribute your knowledge to the climate policy process. Thanks.
Thanks, Koko. Very thought-provoking intervention there. Walter, over to you. You've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, a few remarks on the issue of causality. I'm a lawyer, so I will not comment on separate multi-causality, all these kind of things, for a very specific reason. I think one of the problems we have looking at the discussions on climate refugees is exactly that we are looking at causes instead of effects. From a human rights perspective, if you're taking the Teitiota decision by the Human Rights Committee and others, what is really decisive in terms of who deserves protection is what would be the effects if the person would not be admitted or being sent back. And then you can open up much more and you can get out of these boxes. This is climate related, this is not climate related, this is this or this is that. I mean, this is one of the problems we have with the 51 Convention, that it looks at one cause and leaves out many who have as good causes to leave a country, but remain excluded because it's not the effects, but the causes that are the criteria. So let's look at effects more than at causes. That's the legal perspective.
Very good. Thank you, Walter, for the legal perspective. A last word from Max Martin. Anything that you'd like to add to the interventions you've heard so far?
Okay, good. Quickly, I quite support Francois' talk about mention of listening. I think they know the best. This also aids very practical because they know how to move and what prevents movement and what encourages movement. Yes, seriously listen to people move and people who wish to move and people who cannot move. That's the primary prerequisite for policy making, I would say. It's very commonsensical, but it doesn't work, at least in places where I work. I don't see that very often. Listen to people, but it's also, there is a more moral imperative to listen to people because these are people who are facing the impacts of climate change for no fault of theirs. Many of the people who displaced from the islands I talked about, their carbon footprint is equals to a couple of kerosene lamps that they light every night. They don't even, many of them don't even use outboard engines on their fishing boats or fertilizers for their farms. So there is a very strong moral imperative to listen to people and take them seriously. As a corollary, probably the migration discourse has to take into account sustainable development goals also as a kind of a framework which includes movement and better livelihoods and so on. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that's, I think, a very positive and useful way to end what's been an excellent discussion. It looks like that's all we've got time for. We're in fact pretty much dead to time. Alongside the interventions, of course, of the presenters, there is also a very rich discussion that's taken place in the chat box alongside the presentations. So please do use that as a resource. Very useful comments, questions, resources, published resources available there too. So allow me to draw the proceedings to a close by expressing my thanks to colleagues at PDD, the RLI, and of course our 4 fantastic presenters today, and also to each one of you for participating remotely for this great session. We really look forward to seeing you for the second session in this series, which will be on data and knowledge on human mobility in the context of natural hazards, something which I think has been underlying some of the discussions today. That's going to take place on the 11th of November, so we look forward to seeing you then. Until then, allow me to say goodbye, good afternoon, and have a very enjoyable rest of your days.
Thank you for the organization.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.